What if I told you that the darkest secrets of the Gilded Age were hidden not in dark alleys, but behind the velvet curtains of the wealthiest mansions? We are used to seeing this era through the prism of balls, diamond tiaras, and incredible architecture. But behind all this glitz was a huge army of invisible people. Women whose names were erased from history as easily as chalk from a blackboard lived in constant fear of making a single mistake. Their fates depended on the mood of the mistress of the house, a missing silver spoon, or a chance glance from the master of the house. Sudden dismissal meant not just the loss of a job, but often complete disappearance from life, falling to the bottom of society, or dying in obscurity. The luxurious facades of Fifth Avenue houses reliably kept the secrets of where the young and healthy girls who had served there for years disappeared to. It was a system where the wealth of some was built on the absolute powerlessness and silence of others, forced to pay for a piece of bread with their freedom. Watch the video to the end to find out how a simple piece of paper could become a death sentence for an honest girl, and why thousands of maids disappeared without a trace, leaving behind not even a gravestone. Are you ready to learn the truth about how a single stroke of the pen could destroy a human life in a second? In the world of Victorian servants, there was a document that was more important than a passport, money, or even one's own name. We are talking about a letter of recommendation, or character reference, without which it was absolutely impossible to find employment in a respectable household. The mistress of the house had unlimited power over the future of her maid, holding this simple piece of paper in her hands. Refusal to issue a recommendation was tantamount to a black mark, closing the doors of all the houses in the city and its surroundings. A girl could work in a mansion for 5 or 10 years, giving all her strength and health, but leave with nothing because of a momentary whim. The reason for refusing a recommendation could be anything, from accidentally breaking a vase to not being respectful enough in her response. There were no unions or laws to protect women from the whims of their employers in those harsh times. Often, mistresses used the threat of withholding a recommendation as a tool of blackmail, forcing maids to work beyond all measure. The system of information exchange between wealthy ladies was perfectly organized, and rumors spread faster than mail coaches. At social gatherings and tea parties, mistresses discussed their servants, forming blacklists from which there was no return. To be included on such a list meant becoming an outcast, whom even the most modest household with a small income would not take in. Many girls finding themselves in such a situation tried to forge letters, risking imprisonment for fraud. It was an act of desperation when the choice was between starvation and crime for survival. But experienced housekeepers in wealthy homes knew how to spot forgeries and often checked information through their own channels. There were cases when recommendations were not given simply out of jealousy or malice if the maid was too beautiful or sweet. Youth and attractiveness in this world often became not a gift, but a curse leading to tragedy. The mistress might see a threat in a young maid and get rid of her preventively, depriving her of the opportunity to find employment elsewhere. This dependence created an atmosphere of absolute psychological slavery, where a woman ceased to be a person and became a thing. She had no right to be in a bad mood, sick, or tired, as all of this could be considered insolence. Every movement, every breath was controlled by the fear of losing the cherished piece of paper that gave her the right to live. History knows many examples when, after being dismissed without recommendations, women disappeared into the fog of the big city forever. They disappeared from censuses and letters to their relatives, dissolving into the faceless mass of the urban poor. No one looked for them because for society they ceased to exist the moment they lost their place. This cruel system was upheld by the mutual support of high society, which jealously guarded its privileges and the right to execute or pardon. For them, it was simply a matter of managing their household, devoid of any moral connotations. But for thousands of women, it was a matter of life and death, decided with a stroke of the pen on perfumed paper. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about one person's unlimited power over another's fate? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. What if I told you that the main danger to a young girl came not from hard work, but from those who were supposed to protect her? In huge mansions where dozens of people lived, maids often found themselves completely defenseless against the attention of the male half of the household. The sons of the owners, guests, or the heads of families themselves often viewed maids as accessible entertainment that required no commitment. A girl could not refuse a young master because it threatened immediate dismissal and a scandal in which she would always be found guilty. The society of that time lived by double standards. Men were forgiven for any mischief, while women had to be paragons of morality. If the relationship became public or led to pregnancy, the maid's fate was sealed instantly and irrevocably. She was shown the door immediately, often without even being allowed to gather her modest belongings. No investigation or attempt to establish the truth was conducted, as the family's reputation was paramount. A pregnant, unmarried maid became a stain on the family's honor, which had to be washed away as soon as possible. She was declared promiscuous, accused of seducing an innocent young man, and removed from the family's life. It was at this moment that the mysterious disappearance, whispered about by the remaining servants, took place. The girl was given a little money for her silence and asked to leave the city, never to be seen again. Often such disappearances were explained by the sudden illness of relatives or an urgent departure to their homeland. Left on the street without references or support, these women found themselves in a complete dead end. It was impossible to return to their native village in disgrace, as condemnation from the community and family awaited them there. City shelters were overcrowded, and conditions in them resembled prisons, where disease and hunger reigned. Fear of such an outcome forced maids to hide their pregnancies until the last moment, lacing themselves into corsets until they fainted. They worked themselves to exhaustion, carrying heavy buckets and coal, hoping that everything would be fine or that they would have a miscarriage. It was a time of quiet horror, lived out alone in cold rooms under the roof. Rumors of such incidents circulated among the servants, but discussing them aloud was strictly forbidden under threat of dismissal. Everyone knew the truth, but everyone remained silent, maintaining the illusion of order and propriety in the great house. Silence was the price they paid for a roof over their heads and the meager food they received. Do you think it was fair for society to place all the blame on the woman in such situations? In the next chapter, you will learn how the very atmosphere of these houses slowly killed their inhabitants. Want to know the secret that slowly poisoned the lives of those who cleaned for years? The luxurious interiors of the Victorian era required careful maintenance, but the products used for this maintenance were veritable chemical weapons. Maids came into daily contact with substances that are now considered deadly poisons, without even suspecting it. Lead, mercury, and arsenic-based compounds were used to clean carpets, polish furniture, and wash laundry. Green wallpaper and fabrics, which were fashionable at the time, often contained huge doses of arsenic, the dust from which settled in the lungs of the cleaners. Daily inhalation of this dust led to chronic poisoning, the symptoms of which were mistaken for ordinary fatigue or colds. The girls turned pale, lost their hair, suffered from headaches and weakness, but continued to work. The whiteness of their employers' collars and cuffs was achieved with caustic bleaches that corroded the skin of their hands to the point of deep ulcers. Rubber gloves did not exist, and the hands of laundresses and maids were constantly covered with red scabs and cracks. This pain was their constant companion, impossible to get rid of day or night. Polishing silver and copper required the use of paste containing cyanides and other toxic compounds. The vapors of these substances accumulated in poorly ventilated pantries where maids spent hours at work. Slow intoxication destroyed the nervous system, leading to tremors and mental disorders. Often, such silent deaths were attributed to natural causes without any investigation. The girl simply disappeared from the house and was replaced by a new, healthy victim of this beautiful but poisonous system. The cycle of people ensured the perfect shine of the parquet and the gleam of the silverware. The floors were waxed with turpentine, and the maids had to crawl on their knees for hours, inhaling the fumes. The famous maid's knee, inflammation of the joint capsule, was not only painful, it could lead to disability. But a limping maid was not needed in a house where speed and silence were valued. Thus, the beauty and comfort of a Victorian home came at the cost of the health and lives of those who created that comfort. Behind the gleaming facade were wards for the chronically ill, which were the servants' rooms. Like this if you are struck by the hidden price of cleanliness in the past. Guess how long it took to turn an honest person into a criminal without trial or investigation? In a world where material values were placed above human values, the loss of any item was a tragedy for the servants. If the mistress couldn't find her brooch, glove, or silver spoon, the maid was always the first to come under suspicion. The presumption of innocence did not apply behind the doors of wealthy mansions, where the word of the masters was law. Often, items were lost due to the fault of the owners themselves, who forgot where they had put them or lost them outside the home. However, admitting to their own absent-mindedness was beneath their dignity, so it was easier to accuse someone who could not respond of theft. A maid could be subjected to a humiliating search, with her personal belongings rummaged through and her pockets turned inside out. Even if the item was not found on the maid, the shadow of suspicion already fell on her like an indelible stain. The owners preferred to get rid of the suspicious person so as not to tempt fate in the future. Dismissal on the grounds of dishonesty was tantamount to social suicide. The psychological pressure during such accusations was enormous, forcing some to confess to things they had not done. The fear of prison was so great that dismissal seemed the lesser of two evils. But life after such a dismissal turned into an endless struggle for survival at the bottom of society. Sometimes items were found months later, rolled behind a sofa or forgotten in another coat. But no one sought out the unjustly dismissed maid to apologize and restore her good name. No one cared about her fate anymore. She was spent. This constant threat of being accused kept the servants in a state of permanent stress and fear. They were afraid to touch valuable items unnecessarily, lest they be accused of damaging or stealing them. Work became like walking through a minefield, where every step could be their last. Stories of unjustly accused servants were passed from mouth to mouth, becoming part of servant folklore. This taught them not to trust anyone and to always keep their belongings packed in case of sudden expulsion. The feeling of insecurity was total and all-encompassing. How often do you think the master's consciences tormented them in those days when the missing item was found after all? In the next chapter, we will go up to where these women lived and see their daily lives. The living conditions of the servants were strikingly different from the luxury they served every day. The servants' rooms were usually located on the top floors, under the roof, or in damp basements. In winter, these rooms were bitterly cold, as they were often not heated. In summer, under the scorching roof, the rooms turned into stifling ovens where it was impossible to breathe. The furnishings were Spartan: a hard, narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and perhaps one chair for everyone. There were no carpets, paintings, or cozy little things that could brighten up the dreary surroundings. There was virtually no personal space, as several people often lived in one room. The lack of privacy was one of the hardest trials for people who were tired of constantly being around others. Even at night, they could not be alone with their thoughts, hearing the breathing and snoring of their neighbors. Any letter from home, any personal item became a subject of discussion and curiosity. Sanitary conditions also left much to be desired. A jug of water and a basin were the only luxuries. Hot water was a privilege of the masters, and servants washed with leftovers or cold water. This contributed to the spread of skin diseases and colds, which lingered for months in the damp rooms. In these rooms, it was forbidden to make noise, laugh, or receive guests, even relatives. Life had to be lived in silence and obedience, as if in a strict monastery. Violation of the rules was punishable by fines or dismissal, so discipline was ironclad. Bed linen was rarely changed, and mattresses were often old and stuffed with straw or horsehair. They were infested with bed bugs and fleas, the fight against which was part of the endless daily routine of the maids. Fatigue after a 16-hour working day knocked them off their feet, but sleep was rarely peaceful and restorative. It was here, in these miserable little rooms, that the real lives of the women who created the splendor of the era took place. The contrast between the gilded halls below and the grayness above was simply staggering. They were two different worlds, separated by only a few flights of stairs. Are you ready to learn the truth about why a maid's personal life was strictly forbidden? In most wealthy households, there was an unspoken and sometimes quite official rule: no followers. This term referred to suitors, fiancés, or simply men who showed interest in maids. The owners believed that romantic relationships distracted girls from their direct duties and made their thoughts frivolous. It was practically impossible to date someone openly due to the strict work schedule and lack of free time. The only day off was often Sunday, and even then only half a day after the morning church service. During this short time, the girls tried to build some semblance of a personal life by secretly meeting in parks. If the mistress found out that the maid had a steady boyfriend, it could be a reason for a serious conversation or dismissal. It was believed that a married woman or a woman in a relationship could not devote herself entirely to serving the household. The system required complete self-denial from them, akin to monasticism, but without spiritual reward. This policy condemned thousands of women to deep and hopeless loneliness. Years passed, their youth faded away in other people's nurseries and dressing rooms, and their own families remained an unattainable dream. They nursed other people's children, giving them their unspent maternal love, knowing that they would grow up and forget them. Secret romances did happen, of course, but they were fraught with enormous risk and fear of exposure. Girls would sneak out on dates through back doors, risking being caught by the butler or housekeeper. These rare moments of happiness were stolen from fate and paid for with sleepless nights and anxiety. The inability to start a family pushed some to desperate measures, eloping with strangers or secret marriages, but the secret almost always became public, and then inevitable expulsion from paradise followed. The choice was harsh: either work and a piece of bread or love and complete uncertainty and poverty. The tragedy was that the system did not see them as women in need of love and warmth. They were merely functional units, tools for maintaining order, deprived of the right to feelings, and this emotional abuse was no less terrible than physical deprivation. Do you think such harsh prohibitions could completely kill the desire to love? Or did they only make feelings more acute? In the next chapter, you will learn what such constant suppression of emotions led to. Constant nervous tension, physical exhaustion, and social isolation took their toll on the maid's mental health. Cases of nervous breakdowns, then referred to as hysteria or melancholy, were alarmingly frequent but carefully concealed. A woman who suddenly began to cry for no reason or froze in the middle of a room became a burden on the household. In a world where efficiency and invisibility were valued, showing emotional pain was unacceptable. Instead of help and sympathy, such women were met with irritation from their employers and fear from their colleagues. They were considered damaged, strange, and attempts were made to get rid of them as quickly and quietly as possible. Dismissal in such a state was effectively a death sentence, as a sick mind made it impossible to find new work. Many of those who disappeared from wealthy homes ended their days in city mental hospitals. Conditions in these institutions were appalling and more reminiscent of prisons than hospitals. Once there, it was virtually impossible to return to normal life. It was a one-way ticket. The reason for breakdowns was often the inability to express one's emotions and the constant need to keep up appearances. A maid had to be always friendly, submissive, and imperturbable, no matter what was going on in her soul. This constant wearing of a mask destroyed the personality from within, leading to deep depression. Loneliness in a crowd exacerbated the situation. There were people around, but no one to talk to heart to heart. Competition and snitching among servants made sincere friendship a rare and dangerous phenomenon. People found themselves locked in their own heads with their fears and troubles. The fear of madness hung over the servants' quarters, forcing women to hide their problems until the very end. They drank opium tinctures, available in pharmacies at the time, to calm themselves, which only exacerbated the problem with addiction. It was a vicious circle from which there was no escape. Society preferred to ignore this problem, attributing it all to weak female nature. No one thought about the fact that inhuman living conditions could break even the strongest psyche. As a result, behind the glossy image of the perfect home often lay broken souls whose pain remained invisible. And this silent suffering was perhaps the most terrible secret of Victorian mansions. Governesses and companions occupied a special and often tragic position in the home. These women usually came from impoverished noble families and were well educated. They were not servants in the strict sense of the word, but neither were they equals to their employers, stuck in a painful social limbo. Their position was imbued with a special kind of loneliness. They were strangers everywhere. The servants disliked them, considering them arrogant and too close to their masters, often playing petty tricks on them. The masters treated them with polite detachment, never allowing them to forget who was paying their wages. The governess ate alone, often in her room or after the family, emphasizing her isolation. For an educated woman, such a life was full of humiliation and intellectual hunger. She saw the luxury and opportunities that were unavailable to her, even though she was equal to the mistress in terms of her upbringing. This gave rise to a deep inner bitterness and a sense of injustice of fate. Her future was uncertain. It was difficult to save money for old age, and finding a husband while living in someone else's house was almost impossible. An aging governess became useless to anyone, and her fate was often sad. Many ended their lives in poverty, huddled in tiny rooms in boarding houses for poor noble girls. Their rooms were slightly better than those of the maids, but they were still government-owned and foreign. It was impossible to create their own world, their own comfort, because at any moment they could be asked to vacate the premises. The feeling of transience and instability never left them. It was from this environment that many tragic stories emerged about unrequited love for the master or his sons. These romances, often existing only in the imagination of unhappy women, became their only consolation. But reality always cruelly shattered these illusions. The governess was a symbol of the hidden tragedy of an educated woman who had no place in a man's world. Her mind, talents, and soul were locked in a cramped cage of other people's rules and expectations. She disappeared quietly from history, leaving no descendants, turning into a vague image in old photographs. An extra woman in a world where all the places were taken. One of the most powerful tools for suppressing personality was the practice of renaming servants. In many large houses, there were traditional names for certain positions, regardless of the person's real name. All footmen could be called John or Thomas, and maids Mary or Sarah. This erased individuality, turning a living person into a function, a replaceable part of a mechanism. When entering service, a girl was often forced to give up the name she was given at baptism. It was a symbolic act of submission, a rejection of her past and her identity. The owners were simply too lazy to remember new names, and this was considered the norm of etiquette at the time. Uniforms completed the process of depersonalization, making all maids look like identical black and white figures. The strict dress code did not allow for any personal jewelry or expressions of individual taste. People became part of the interior, just like furniture or curtains. Servants often referred to themselves in the third person or used their job titles instead of their names. The maid will do it. The cook will bring it. This is how they began to perceive themselves. This deeply ingrained in their minds the idea of their own insignificance and inferiority. Psychologists say that a name is the foundation of personality, and taking it away is an act of violence. But in the Victorian era, it was considered simply a convenience for the masters. A convenience that broke the backbone of human dignity. Dozens of Marys and Annes passed through the houses, leaving no trace, merging into one faceless blur. No one cared about their personal qualities, dreams, or talents as long as they did their jobs well. Thus, the system destroyed uniqueness, turning living people into obedient robots. And this was perhaps the most cynical manifestation of class inequality. The fate of an old servant was one of the bleakest scenarios of that era. There were no pensions, and as soon as a woman lost her strength and could no longer work, she became useless. Very few families kept their old servants out of mercy, feeding them in the kitchen. Most simply threw them out onto the street when they had served their purpose. It was almost impossible to save for old age on a meager salary, especially if a woman was helping her relatives. All the money went on clothes, medicine, or was sent to elderly parents in the village. By the age of 50, 60, a maid found herself destitute, without a home, without a family, and without means. The only option for many was the workhouse, a terrible institution with harsh conditions. People feared ending up there more than death, as it meant a complete loss of freedom and human dignity. The elderly died quickly there from poor food, cold, and backbreaking labor. Some tried to sell trinkets on the streets, becoming the very beggars we see in engravings. It was a fall from the heights of parquet floors into the mud of sewage ditches. The contrast between the past and the present was painful and unbearable. Their graves were often unmarked, in common pits for the poor, as there was no money for funerals. This was how a life completely devoted to serving strangers ended. The ending was logical and cruel, like the whole system of that era. History has not preserved their faces, but it was on their bones that the prosperity of good old England and America stood. They were the fuel for the machine of progress and luxury, burned to ashes. Looking back, we understand that their disappearance was not mystical, but a social inevitability. The system was built to squeeze and discard without looking back. These stories reveal the dark side of a glittering era that is not usually written about in romance novels. Behind the rustle of silk and the clink of crystal lay thousands of broken lives and silent tragedies. Women who devoted their lives to creating comfort for others often found themselves without a home or warmth. Their disappearances were not a mystery, but a cruel norm of life, where a person without money and status was nothing. We must remember these invisible victims in order to understand the true price of historical luxury. Which topic from the lives of the invisible people of history touched you the most? And what would you like to learn about in future episodes? Be sure to subscribe to the channel so that we can continue to uncover the secrets of the past together with you.